Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How would you provide samples of customer conversations to an external service provider while ensuring that personally identifiable information is not shared?
I would create an Amazon DynamoDB table and an AWS Lambda function that reads data from the files while excluding any PII. The Lambda function would store the non-PII data in the DynamoDB table.
What would you recommend to improve the recovery time for a legacy system running on a single Amazon EC2 instance?
I would recommend enabling termination protection for the EC2 instance.
What solution would you recommend for deploying containerized application workloads across 3 availability zones with minimal changes and operational overhead?
I would recommend using Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service with self-managed nodes and configuring application autoscaling to use target tracking.
How would you manage the storage of movies in Amazon S3 to meet the streaming requirements and minimize costs?
I would store all media content in Amazon S3 and use S3 lifecycle policies to move media data into the infrequent access tier when the demand for a movie decreases.
How would you design a serverless architecture for an application provided as a Docker container image that requires 50 GB of storage for temporary files?
I would create an AWS Lambda function that uses the Docker container image with an Amazon Elastic Block Store volume that has more than 50 GB of space.
How can a company use its on-premises LDAP directory service to authenticate users to the AWS Management Console if the directory service is not compatible with SAML?
The solution is to set up a process that rotates the IAM credentials whenever the LDAP credentials are updated.
How can a company recover accidentally deleted Amazon machine images quickly and efficiently?
The company can upload the AMIs to an Amazon S3 bucket that has cross-region replication.
What would be the most cost-effective way to move 150 terabytes of archived image data to AWS given the network limitations?
The best option would be to use AWS Snowmobile to ship the data to AWS.
What solution would you recommend for migrating a 3-tier application to AWS with minimal changes and a database that can restore data to a specific point in time?
I would recommend migrating the web tier and application tier to Amazon EC2 instances in private subnets, and migrating the database tier to Amazon RDS for MySQL in private subnets.
How would you provide access to an Amazon SQS queue for another company without giving up account permissions?
I would create an instance profile that provides the other company access to the SQS queue.
What is the most cost-effective way for developers to gain secure SSH access to Amazon EC2 instances running in a private subnet?
The best solution is to create an AWS site-to-site VPN connection between the corporate network and the VPC. This allows developers to access the EC2 instances when they are on the corporate network.
What storage solution would you recommend for a pharmaceutical company that needs to make a subset of a large data set immediately available while reducing capital expenses?
I would recommend deploying an AWS Storage Gateway File Gateway with an Amazon S3 bucket as the target storage and migrating the data to the Storage Gateway appliance.
How can a company revert an Amazon DynamoDB table to any point within the last 24 hours with minimal operational overhead?
The best approach is to use an AWS Lambda function to create an on-demand backup of the table every hour.
How would you design a cost-effective architecture for processing files uploaded to an Amazon S3 bucket?
I would recommend configuring Amazon Kinesis data streams to process and send data to Amazon S3 and then invoke an AWS Lambda function to handle the file processing.
What solution would you recommend for optimizing costs for a company's application deployed on AWS, where production instances have constant usage and non-production instances are used only during business hours?
I would recommend using dedicated hosts for the production instances and EC2 instance savings plans for the non-production instances.
How would you migrate data from an on-premises Oracle database to Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL while capturing ongoing changes?
I would use an AWS Snowball device to transfer the data to an Amazon S3 bucket and then import that data into Aurora PostgreSQL using the AWS Dizzet S3 extension.
How would you run a Docker container application in the AWS Cloud while ensuring it can scale according to demand without adding operational overhead?
I would use Amazon Elastic Container Service with AWS Fargate for seamless scaling and management. Additionally, I could set up an Amazon API Gateway API connected to AWS Lambda to run the containers.
How would you manage sudden traffic increases during a seasonal online sale for an e-commerce company using Amazon EC2?
I would create an auto-scaling group that is large enough to handle peak traffic loads. I would stop half of the EC2 instances and configure the auto-scaling group to use those stopped instances to scale out when traffic increases.
How would you provide an automated solution to ensure compliance with the security policy regarding SSH access?
I would create an IAM role with permissions to open security groups and network ACLs globally, and then set up an Amazon Simple Notification Service topic to notify whenever the role is assumed.
How would you design a solution for service-to-service communication over HTTPS in a multi-account AWS environment?
I would create an inspection VPC, deploy an AWS network firewall there, attach it to a new transit gateway, and route VPC to VPC traffic through the inspection VPC while applying firewall rules to allow only HTTPS communication.
What would you recommend to improve the metadata load times for a mobile game that uses Amazon RDS?
I would recommend adding an Amazon Elasticache for memcached layer in front of the database.
How can a company share approved Amazon machine images with a development organizational unit while using AWS Key Management Service encrypted snapshots?
The company can add the organization's root Amazon resource name to the launch permission list for the AMIs and update the key policy to allow the development team's organizational unit to use the AWS KMS keys for decryption.
What would be the most cost-effective solution for migrating a large amount of data from multiple global offices to Amazon S3?
The most cost-effective solution would be to use an AWS Snowmobile to store and transfer the data to Amazon S3.
How can you ensure that applications on Amazon EC2 instances can read a dataset in Amazon EFS without modifying it?
The best approach is to mount the EFS file system in read-only mode from the EC2 instances.
How would you securely grant an external vendor access to your company's AWS account?
I would create an IAM role in the company's account to delegate access to the vendor's IAM role and attach the necessary IAM policies for the permissions the vendor needs.
How can a company ensure accountability for cloud spending in each department and notify the CFO when spending reaches 60% of the budget?
The company can use cost allocation tags on AWS resources to label the owners. Then they can create usage budgets in AWS budgets and set an alert threshold to notify when spending exceeds 60% of the budget.
How would you design a secure architecture for an internal web application on AWS that should only be accessible from the company's office?
I would deploy the web application on Amazon EC2 instances in private subnets behind an internal application load balancer. I would also deploy NAT gateways in public subnets and attach an internet gateway to the VPC, setting the inbound source of the ALB's security group to the company's office network CIDR block.
How would you migrate accounting records from an application running on Amazon EC2 to an AWS managed service while ensuring minimal operational support and providing verifiable logs?
I would copy the records into an Amazon Quantum Ledger database, as it meets the requirements for immutable and cryptographically verifiable logs.
How would you handle the data preparation jobs for marketing data uploaded to an Amazon S3 bucket while minimizing operational overhead?
I would use AWS Glue Data Brew to process the data and implement an AWS Step Function state machine to manage the execution of the Data Brew jobs.
How can you ensure that a payment processing application running on AWS Lambda does not process duplicate payments?
I would use Lambda to retrieve all due payments and publish them to an Amazon Simple Queue service FIFO queue. Then, I would configure another Lambda function to poll the FIFO queue and process the payments.
What approach would you recommend for a company looking to collect usage and configuration data about their on-premises servers in order to plan a migration to AWS?
I would recommend setting the home AWS region in AWS Migration Hub and using AWS Application Discovery Service to collect data about the on-premises servers.
How would you ensure that all API calls and logins across AWS accounts are audited with minimal operational overhead?
I would deploy an AWS Control Tower environment in the organization's management account and enable AWS Security Hub and AWS Control Tower Account Factory.
What would be the most cost-effective solution for analyzing 10 TB of log files in Apache Parquet format stored in an S3 bucket using SQL?
The most cost-effective solution would be to create an AWS Glue crawler to manage table metadata and then use Amazon Athena to run SQL statements directly on the data in the S3 bucket.
How can a company prevent AWS Cloud formation stacks from deploying IAM resources with inline policies or public IP addresses for EC2 instances?
The company can use a service control policy to block actions for EC2 instances and IAM resources that lead to noncompliance.
How would you improve the availability and scalability of a web application hosted on a single Amazon EC2 instance in response to increased traffic?
I would configure Amazon EC2 auto-scaling with multiple availability zones in private subnets and set up an application load balancer in a public subnet to distribute the web traffic.
How can a company protect its AWS Lambda environment variables from being viewed in plain text by developers?
The company can create an AWS Key Management Service key and enable encryption helpers on the Lambda functions to use the KMS key for storing and encrypting the environment variables.
What solution would you recommend for an analytics company that wants to use RESTful APIs and requires user authentication with the most operational efficiency?
I would configure an IAM user for user authentication and implement Amazon API Gateway HTTP APIs with an IAM authorizer.
How can a company ensure that the deletion of KMS keys is prevented while notifying administrators when a deletion is attempted?
The company can create an AWS Cloud trail to capture the logs, deliver them to a new Amazon CloudWatch log group, and set up a CloudWatch alarm based on the log metrics. This alarm can then use Amazon SNS to notify administrators when a KMS delete key operation is detected.
What solution would you recommend for generating reports from a mobile app usage analysis program in the most cost-effective way?
I would recommend running the program in AWS Lambda and creating an Amazon Event Bridge rule to trigger the Lambda function when reports are requested.
What solutions would you recommend for optimizing a high-performance computing environment in AWS for networking and storage?
I would recommend creating an Amazon FSx for Lustre file system with Scratch storage and launching Amazon EC2 instances with an Elastic Fabric adapter attached.
How can a company prevent unwanted content in photos from being uploaded to its web application without training a machine learning model?
The company can create an AWS Lambda function that uses Amazon Rekognition to detect unwanted content and then set up a Lambda function URL for the web application to invoke when new photos are uploaded.
How can a company secure its AWS root user account while ensuring access is maintained if the MFA device is lost?
The company should add multiple MFA devices for the root user account to manage access in case of a disaster.
How would you design a rewards program architecture for a social media company that allows rapid partner integration?
I would create an Amazon time stream database to maintain a list of affiliated partners and use an AWS Lambda function to send user IDs to each partner when points are awarded.
How would you extract ingredient names from recipe records stored in an Amazon S3 bucket for a web application?
I would use an Amazon Event Bridge rule to invoke an AWS Lambda function when a put object request occurs. The Lambda function would analyze the object and extract the ingredient names using Amazon SageMaker, then store the output in the DynamoDB table.
How would you enable an AWS Lambda function in a primary account to access files stored in an Amazon EFS located in a secondary account?
I would create a new EFS file system in the primary account and use AWS Data Sync to copy the contents from the original EFS file system.
How would you ensure that highly sensitive data stored in an Amazon S3 bucket is encrypted both in transit and at rest, while managing encryption keys outside of AWS?
I would encrypt the data in the S3 bucket using server-side encryption with an AWS Key Management Service customer-managed key.
How would you run a payment application on AWS that requires basic validation of payment notifications and has a long-running back-end processing application?
I would create an Amazon Simple Queue service queue and integrate it with an Amazon Event Bridge rule to receive payment notifications. The rule would validate the notifications and send them to the back-end application, which I would deploy on Amazon EC2 Spot instances.
What solution would you recommend for designing a user authentication system that requires two-factor authentication for users logging in from different locations or devices?
I would recommend configuring AWS Identity and Access Management users for authentication and attaching an IAM policy that allows the Allow Manage Own User MFA action.
What solution would you recommend for transforming data from an Amazon S3 data lake and loading it into a data warehouse with MPP capabilities?
I would recommend running a daily Amazon EMR job to transform the data and load it into Amazon Aurora Serverless, then using Amazon Aurora ML to create and train the machine learning models.
How would you suggest a company maintain compliance while using Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service and keeping data locally?
I would recommend using an AWS Snowmobile in their data center.
What solution would you recommend for a social media company looking to migrate its on-premises NFS storage to AWS in a cost-effective way?
I would recommend using the Amazon Elastic File System, One Zone Infrequent Access Storage class, and activating the Infrequent Access Lifecycle policy.
How would you optimize AWS Lambda functions that process a high volume of messages while managing costs and service latency?
I would configure provision concurrency for the Lambda functions and decrease the memory allocated to them.
How can a company scan its container images for vulnerabilities when using Amazon Elastic Container Service?
The best approach would be to deploy the workloads to Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service and use Amazon Elastic Container Registry as a private image repository, specifying scan on push filters for the ECR enhanced scan.
How can a company invoke a third-party reporting application when an AWS batch job is successful?
The company can configure the AWS batch job to publish job succeeded events to an Amazon API Gateway REST API. Then set up a proxy integration on the API gateway that triggers an AWS Lambda function, which will invoke the third-party API using the required username and password.
How can a company access data stored in a vendor's Amazon RDS for MySQL database if they do not have an internet gateway or VPN connection?
The company can instruct the vendor to sign up for the AWS Hosted Connection Direct Connect program and then use VPC peering to connect their VPC with the vendor's VPC.
How would you set up Amazon Managed Grafana to visualize data from an Amazon RDS database securely?
I would create an Amazon Managed Grafana workspace in a VPC, then create a private endpoint for the RDS database and configure that as a data source.
What solution would you recommend for transforming data ingested into a data lake on Amazon S3, considering the need for a code-free approach and data lineage?
I would recommend configuring Amazon EMR serverless to transform the data and sharing the transformation steps with employees using EMR serverless jobs.
How would you allow engineers to access a specific development EC2 instance through a public website while ensuring it automatically routes to the instance even if it is replaced?
I would create an A record for the development website pointing to the application load balancer. Then I would set up a listener rule on the ALB to redirect requests for the development website to the public IP address of the development instance.
How would you migrate a container application using AMQP to AWS with minimal operational overhead?
I would migrate the application to Amazon Elastic Container Service and use Amazon Simple Queue Service to handle the messages.
How can an online gaming company improve end-to-end load time for its global customer base using AWS?
The company can create application load balancers in each region to replace the existing network load balancers and register the existing EC2 instances as targets for the ALBs.
How would you enable vendors using legacy applications to upload data to Amazon S3 while minimizing operational overhead?
I would create an AWS Transfer Family endpoint for those vendors.
How would you extract insights and sentiment from news reports for a marketing campaign using Amazon TextRact?
I would store the extracted insights in an Amazon DynamoDB table and then use Amazon SageMaker to build a sentiment model.
What solution would you recommend for ingesting real-time data from third-party applications into an Amazon S3 bucket?
I would recommend creating Amazon Kinesis data streams for data ingestion and then using Amazon Kinesis data firehose delivery streams to consume those data streams, specifying the S3 bucket as the destination.
How can a company efficiently handle large data sizes when using Amazon DynamoDB?
The best solution is to create an AWS Lambda function that uses gzip compression to compress the large objects before writing them to the DynamoDB table.
How would you migrate a legacy application with cron jobs to AWS while minimizing refactoring?
I would create a container image for the cron jobs, use Amazon EventBridge Scheduler for creating a recurring schedule, and run the cron job tasks on AWS Fargate.
How would you load data from Salesforce to Amazon Redshift without using the public internet?
I would create an AWS private link connection in the VPC to Salesforce and use Amazon AppFlow to transfer the data.
What solution would you recommend for optimizing storage costs after migrating an application to AWS?
I would recommend creating an Amazon S3 bucket with an intelligent tiering lifecycle policy, copying all files to that bucket, and updating the application to use the Amazon S3 API for storing and retrieving files.
What solution would you recommend for a robotics company needing a public load balancer in AWS for medical surgery applications?
I would recommend using an application load balancer with a certificate from AWS Certificate Manager. This would allow for query parameter-based routing.
How would you design a highly available and automatically scalable solution for an application currently running on a single Amazon EC2 instance with a MySQL database?
I would deploy the application to EC2 instances configured as a target group behind an application load balancer and create an Amazon RDS for MySQL cluster with multiple instances.
What is the best solution for migrating data to an Amazon S3 bucket while ensuring it is encrypted at rest and the key is rotated automatically every year?
The best solution is to migrate the data to the S3 bucket and use server-side encryption with Amazon S3 managed keys. This method utilizes the built-in key rotation behavior of SSE S3.
What solution would you recommend for enabling single sign-on across multiple AWS accounts while managing users in an on-premises Active Directory?
I would enable AWS IAM Identity Center and configure a two-way Forest Trust relationship to connect the self-managed Active Directory with IAM Identity Center using AWS Directory Service.
If a company wants to deploy an application on an Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL serverless v2 cluster with high traffic, how can they optimize storage performance cost-effectively?
They should configure the cluster storage type as general purpose.
How can a financial services company on AWS ensure that its security controls meet NIST and PCI DSS standards across multiple accounts?
The company should designate one account as the AWS Security Hub Delegated Administrator account from the organization's management account. Then, enable Security Hub for all member accounts and activate the standards for NIST and PCI DSS.
How can a company reduce S3 storage costs while ensuring immediate availability for frequently accessed objects?
The most operationally efficient solution is to create an S3 lifecycle rule to transition objects to the S3 Intelligent Tiering Storage class.
What solution would you recommend for finding mutual connections in a dataset of 5 terabytes with many-to-many relationships?
I would recommend using Amazon Neptune to store the datasets as edges and vertices, and then query the data to find the connections.
What would be the most cost-effective way to establish a secure connection between an on-premises environment and AWS for handling a small amount of traffic?
The most cost-effective method would be to implement an AWS site-to-site VPN connection.
What solution would you recommend for migrating an on-premises SFTP file transfer solution to AWS while using existing Active Directory credentials?
I would recommend creating an AWS Transfer Family server with SFTP endpoints and choosing the AWS Directory Service option as the identity provider, using AD Connector to connect to the on-premises Active Directory.
How would you design an event-driven order processing system with multiple validation steps while ensuring that each validation step has access to only the required information?
I would create an Amazon EventBridge event bus. Then, I would set up an event rule for each validation step and use the input transformer to send only the necessary data to each corresponding Lambda function.
How would you improve the performance of a 3-tier application that requires a MySQL database when migrating to AWS?
I would create an Amazon Aurora MySQL multi-AZ DB cluster with multiple read replicas and configure the application to use the reader endpoint for reports.
How would you enable an on-premises application to access an Amazon S3 bucket over an AWS Direct Connect connection?
I would create a VPC and an Amazon S3 interface endpoint, then route the AWS traffic from the on-premises network to that S3 interface endpoint.
How can a company distribute traffic across 2 AWS regions for a website without using a database?
They can use an Amazon Route 53 multi-value answer routing policy to ensure traffic is directed only to healthy regions.
What solution would you recommend for a company experiencing availability issues with large file storage on Amazon EC2 instances?
I would recommend mounting an Amazon Elastic file system across all the EC2 instances, allowing employees to access the files directly from those instances.
What solution would you recommend for encrypting personally identifiable information at rest in an Amazon RDS database with minimal changes to the infrastructure?
I would recommend configuring Amazon Elastic Block Store encryption and Amazon RDS encryption using AWS Key Management Service keys.
How can a company allow its AWS Lambda function in private subnets to access Amazon S3 without going through the internet?
The company can provision a gateway endpoint for Amazon S3 in the VPC and update the route tables of the subnets accordingly.
What solution would you recommend for a news company to enable reporters to send high-quality live streams to their broadcast system on AWS?
I would recommend using Amazon CloudFront to provide accelerated TCP connections for the live broadcasts.
How would you modify the backup strategy for a company that needs to keep monthly snapshots for 7 years?
I would keep the daily snapshots in the EBS Snapshot Standard tier for 1 month and then copy the monthly snapshots to Amazon S3 Glacier Deep Archive with a retention period of 7 years.
How would you replicate data from an Amazon EFS file system to another AWS region in a cost-effective way?
I would use AWS Backup to create a backup plan that takes daily backups and replicates them to another region, assigning the EFS file system to that plan.
How would you ensure high availability and scalability for an e-commerce company's workload when migrating to AWS?
I would migrate the web application to Amazon EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group across 2 availability zones, using an application load balancer. For the database, I would use Amazon RDS with multi-AZ deployment.
What service would you recommend for copying application-generated files to AWS from an on-premises SMB file share?
I would recommend AWS Storage Gateway.
How would you efficiently send email messages to employees on their work anniversaries using DynamoDB?
I would create an AWS Lambda function that scans the DynamoDB table and uses Amazon's simple notification service to send the email messages. Then, I would schedule this Lambda function to run every day.
How would you ensure an auto-scaling group increases capacity proactively for anticipated traffic spikes during holidays?
I would create a recurring scheduled action to scale up the auto-scaling group before the peak demand period.
How can a company implement password rotation for its Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL databases with the least operational overhead?
The best solution is to store the password in AWS Secrets Manager and enable automatic rotation on the secret.
How would you migrate an application running on Oracle Database Enterprise Edition to AWS cost-effectively while retaining third-party database features?
I would migrate the database to Amazon RDS Custom for Oracle using native tools and customize the new database settings to support the third-party features.
How can a university automate data backups for its AWS services?
The university can use AWS Backup to configure and monitor all backups for the services in use.
How would you recommend a company build a map of its IT infrastructure to identify security risks with minimal operational overhead?
I would recommend using Amazon Neptune to store the data and using SparkQL to query it for identifying security risks.
What is the most cost-effective solution for providing globally located developers with managed PostgreSQL databases for development purposes?
The best solution is to create an Amazon Aurora serverless cluster and develop an AWS Service Catalog product to launch databases in that cluster with the default capacity settings.
How would you ensure that all EC2 instances share up-to-date website content with minimal lag time?
I would copy the website assets to an Amazon Elastic file system and configure each EC2 instance to mount the EFS file system locally.
What steps would you take to automatically detect and respond to suspicious behavior in an AWS environment that includes multiple EC2 instances and an RDS database?
I would use Amazon Guard Duty for threat detection. Then I would configure Amazon Event Bridge to filter for Guard Duty findings and invoke an AWS Lambda function to adjust the AWS WAF rules.
How can a company securely authenticate Amazon EC2 instances to an Amazon Aurora database without maintaining static credentials?
The solution is to store the database username and password in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store and configure the EC2 instances to retrieve the credentials from there.
How can a company configure its Amazon CloudFront distribution to use SSL TLS certificates without incurring additional costs?
The company can request an Amazon-issued private certificate from AWS Certificate Manager in the U.S. East 1 region.
How would you provide an external consultant access to an annual report stored in an Amazon S3 bucket for a week?
I would generate a pre-signed URL that allows access to the report and share that URL with the consultant.
What solution would you recommend for running a high-performance computing workload on Amazon EC2 that requires low latency and high network throughput?
I would recommend configuring an on-demand capacity reservation when launching the EC2 instances.
What connection solution would you recommend for ensuring maximum resiliency between data centers and a VPC on AWS?
I would recommend 2 AWS Direct Connect connections from each of the primary and secondary data centers, terminating at 2 Direct Connect locations on separate devices.
How can a finance team optimize costs for Amazon RDS for Oracle instances using AWS Trusted Advisor?
They can use the Trusted Advisor recommendations in the member accounts where the RDS instances are running and review the checks for Amazon RDS reserved instance optimization.
How would you optimize the network architecture for an application running on Amazon EC2 instances that need to access large files in Amazon S3 while minimizing data transfer costs?
I would create an AWS Private Link Interface endpoint for Amazon S3 in the VPC and add an entry for the interface endpoint in the route tables for the private subnets.
How would you design the architecture for relocating an on-premises MySQL database to AWS, considering high write operation traffic?
I would provision an Amazon RDS for MySQL DB instance with provisioned IOPS SSD storage. I would also monitor write operation metrics using Amazon CloudWatch and adjust the provisioned IOPS as necessary.
How would you re-architect an application in the AWS Cloud to ensure sensitive archival data files are encrypted before being stored in an S3 bucket?
I would configure the application to use client-side encryption with a key stored in AWS Key Management Service, then store the archival files in the S3 bucket.
How can a company ensure daily backups of its Amazon RDS database for regulatory compliance with minimal operational overhead?
The company can modify the RDS database to set a retention period of 30 days for automated backups.
How can a company using an Amazon Aurora DB cluster improve performance during peak usage hours?
The company can create an Aurora read replica in the existing cluster. This would allow the application to use the replica endpoint for read-only queries while continuing to use the cluster endpoint for write queries.
What steps would you take to enhance the performance of a near real-time streaming application on AWS experiencing high latency?
I would use Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose to ingest the data and AWS Lambda with AWS step functions to process it.
How can a company ensure that sensitive data from its web application on Amazon EC2 instances is written to an S3 bucket without using the public internet?
The solution is to create a gateway VPC endpoint for Amazon S3 and set up a route in the VPC route table to that endpoint.
How would you analyze and optimize the cost of Amazon EBS volumes for a production workload?
I would use AWS Compute Optimizer to generate recommendations for optimizing the EBS volumes.
How can a company identify all S3 buckets that are not versioning enabled across AWS regions?
They can use Amazon S3 Storage Lens to identify those buckets.
How would you enhance an e-commerce order processing application on AWS to ensure each order is processed exactly once during traffic surges?
I would create an Amazon Simple Queue Service FIFO queue to hold all the orders and configure an AWS Lambda function to process them.
How would you manage access for developers in a development account to push code changes to a production account in AWS?
I would create an IAM role in the production account, define a trust policy that specifies the development account, and allow developers to assume that role.
How would you restrict access to the content of a web application using AWS authorization techniques while ensuring low login latency?
I would configure Amazon Cognito for authentication, implement Lambda Edge for authorization, and use Amazon CloudFront to serve the application globally.
How can a solutions architect prevent the launch of large Amazon EC2 instances across multiple AWS accounts with minimal operational overhead?
The architect can create an organization in AWS Organizations in the management account, then establish a service control policy that denies the launch of large EC2 instances and apply it to the AWS accounts.
How would you automate inventory and updates for a fleet of EC2 instances running different operating systems?
I would recommend setting up AWS Systems Manager Patch Manager to manage all the EC2 instances and configuring AWS Security Hub to produce monthly reports.
What solution would you recommend for ensuring an application hosted in AWS is available from another region with minimal downtime for disaster recovery?
I would recommend creating an auto-scaling group and an elastic load balancer in the disaster recovery region. Additionally, configure the DynamoDB table as a global table and set up DNS failover to direct traffic to the new region's load balancer.
How can an application running on Amazon EC2 instances in a private subnet store and retrieve data from Amazon S3 without using the public internet?
The most cost-effective solution is to deploy an S3 gateway endpoint to access the S3 buckets.
How would you ensure high availability for an application hosted on Amazon EC2 instances in a single availability zone?
I would configure a network load balancer for TCP traffic and an application load balancer for HTTP and HTTPS traffic. Additionally, I would create an auto-scaling group that uses multiple availability zones and runs health checks on the instances.
How can a company add a dynamic contact form to its static website hosted on Amazon S3 while ensuring cost-effectiveness?
The best solution is to create an Amazon API gateway endpoint that returns the contact form from an AWS Lambda function. Then configure another Lambda function to publish a message to an Amazon Simple Notification Service topic when the form is filled out.
How can a company ensure that notifications are sent to the appropriate employees based on notification categories in AWS organizations?
The company should configure each AWS account to use different email distribution lists for each business unit. Each list should have administrator email addresses that can respond to alerts, and they should also set up alternate contacts for each account with distribution lists for billing, security, and operations teams.
How would you re-architect an e-commerce application on AWS to handle peak usage without timeouts?
I would configure an auto-scaling group of new EC2 instances to retry purchases until processing is complete and update the applications to connect to the DB cluster using Amazon RDS proxy. Additionally, I would update the application to send purchase requests to an Amazon SQS queue and set up another auto-scaling group of EC2 instances to read from that queue.
How can a company create a custom dashboard to view NAT gateway costs using AWS services?
The company can share an Amazon QuickSight dashboard that includes the requested table visual and configure QuickSight to use Amazon Athena to query the new report.
How would you implement caching for a high-traffic static website on Amazon S3 while ensuring stale content isn't served for too long?
I would set the CloudFront default TTL to 2 minutes and add a cache control max age directive of 24 hours to the objects in S3. During deployment, I would create a CloudFront invalidation to clear any changed files from the edge caches.
How would you ensure that Lambda functions have direct network access to EC2 instances while minimizing costs?
I would purchase a compute savings plan and connect the Lambda functions to the private subnets where the EC2 instances are located.
How can a company implement controls to limit AWS resource costs for developers using a multi-account strategy?
The best approach is to use AWS budgets to set budgets for each developer account. You can set up alerts to notify developers when they exceed their budget or are forecasted to do so. Additionally, AWS Budget's actions can apply a deny-all policy to the developer's IAM role to prevent launching more resources once the budget is reached.
What security group configurations would you recommend for a 3-tier web application hosted on AWS?
I would recommend configuring the web tier's security group to allow inbound HTTPS traffic from the ALB security group. For the database tier, I would allow inbound Microsoft SQL Server traffic from the application's security group. Lastly, I would configure the application's security group to allow inbound HTTPS traffic from the web tier's security group.
How would you cost optimize a workload that uses Amazon EC2, AWS Lambda, AWS Fargate, and Amazon SageMaker?
I would purchase a compute savings plan for Amazon EC2, Lambda, and SageMaker, as well as another compute savings plan for Lambda, Fargate, and Amazon EC2.
What steps would you take to migrate a Microsoft SQL Server database to an Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL database with minimal changes to the application code?
I would migrate the database schema and data using the AWS Schema Conversion tool and AWS Database Migration Service. Additionally, I would use Amazon RDS Proxy to connect the applications to Aurora PostgreSQL.
How can a company ensure that all newly created Amazon EBS volumes are encrypted by default and prevent unencrypted volumes?
The company can configure the EC2 account attributes to always encrypt new EBS volumes.
How would you collect user clickstream data from an e-commerce website for real-time analysis, considering fluctuating traffic patterns?
I would use a data stream in Amazon Kinesis data streams in on-demand mode to capture the clickstream data and then use AWS Lambda to process the data in real time.
How can a company identify all S3 buckets that are not versioning enabled across different AWS regions?
They can use Amazon S3 Storage Lens to identify all S3 buckets that are not versioning enabled.
How can a company optimize its Amazon S3 storage costs for files that need to be stored for 4 years and accessed frequently in the first 30 days?
The best approach is to create an S3 lifecycle policy that moves the files to S3 Standard and Frequent Access after 30 days and then to S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval after 4 years.
How can a company optimize its critical storage application running in AWS to send user data to the nearest S3 bucket while minimizing management efforts?
The best solution would be to use an active-passive configuration with S3 multi-region access points and create a global endpoint for each region.
How would you ensure reliable and fault-tolerant migration of legacy applications hosted on individual virtual servers to AWS?
I would create an Amazon machine image of each application instance, launch 2 new EC2 instances from the AMI, place them in separate availability zones, and configure a network load balancer with those EC2 instances as targets.
How would you isolate workloads in AWS while managing networking components and ensuring security controls?
I would use AWS Control Tower to deploy accounts, create a networking account with a VPC that has both private and public subnets, and then use AWS Resource Access Manager to share the subnets with the workload accounts.
How would you minimize hosting costs for a website that serves static content on Amazon EC2?
I would move the website to an Amazon S3 bucket and configure an Amazon CloudFront distribution for it.
What solution would you recommend for a company needing a shared storage solution on AWS that supports SMB clients with minimal administrative overhead?
I would recommend creating an Amazon FSx for Windows file server file system and connecting the application server to that file system.
What would you recommend for a disaster recovery strategy for a MySQL database on an Amazon Aurora cluster, considering a 5-minute recovery point objective and a 20-minute recovery time objective?
I would recommend converting the Aurora cluster to an Aurora Global Database and configuring managed failover.
How would you run a critical data analysis job on AWS that requires at least 1 hour to complete and cannot tolerate interruptions?
I would create a container for the job and schedule it to run as an AWS Fargate task on an Amazon Elastic Container Service cluster using Amazon Event Bridge Scheduler.
How can a company centrally collect security data in the AWS Cloud with minimal development effort?
The best approach would be to configure a data lake in Amazon Security Lake to collect the security data and upload it to an Amazon S3 bucket.
What solution would you recommend for migrating 5 on-premises applications to AWS while ensuring they can communicate with a shared services VPC with minimal administrative overhead?
I would recommend deploying a transit gateway with associations between the transit gateway and the application VPCs, as well as the shared services VPC, along with adding the necessary routes.
How would you run an on-premises application in a hybrid environment using Amazon Elastic Container Service?
I would set up an ECS cluster using the AWS Fargate launch type for the cloud application containers and use Amazon ECS Anywhere for the on-premises containers. Additionally, I would set up an application load balancer for the cloud ECS services.
How would you migrate sensitive and critical data from on-premises SQL Server instances to AWS while increasing security and reducing operational overhead?
I would migrate the databases to a multi-AZ Amazon RDS for SQL Server DB instance and use AWS Key Management Service Managed Keys for encryption.
What solution would you recommend for migrating an application to AWS while increasing its availability and using AWS WAF?
I would recommend creating an auto-scaling group with multiple Amazon EC2 instances across 2 availability zones, configuring an application load balancer, and connecting a WF to the ALB.
How would you restrict access to specific prefixes in an Amazon S3 bucket for different applications?
I would create dedicated S3 access points and access point policies for each application.
How would you change an application to process images uploaded to an Amazon S3 bucket in a cost-effective manner?
I would use S3 event notifications to send a message with the image details to an Amazon Simple Queue service queue, and then configure an AWS Lambda function to read those messages and process the images.
What actions would you take to enhance the availability and performance of a hybrid application involving both TCP and UDP workloads?
I would create an accelerator using AWS Global Accelerator and add the load balancers as endpoints. Additionally, I would configure a network load balancer in each region for the EC2 endpoints and another network load balancer for the on-premises endpoints.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.